Please, don't walk away this time.
Sir, I don't know you. Why are you doing this?
Because I've carried this guilt every single day for 34 years.
Who are you?
The man who should have found you long ago. I've spent 34 years begging God for one more chance to look into your eyes and tell you how deeply sorry I am.
The dining room at the Ellery Room smelled of butter and candle wax and old money, the kind of scent that clings to velvet curtains and never quite leaves the walls. Crystal chandeliers threw soft gold light across white tablecloths, and somewhere near the back corner a table of 6 executives laughed a little too loudly at a joke none of the waitstaff were allowed to hear. At the center of that laughter stood a man named Elijah Carter, 34 years old, refilling water glasses with a steady hand, while his own frayed shoelace peeked out from beneath a pressed black uniform he had ironed at 4 in the morning. He did not react to the laughter. He had learned a long time ago that reacting only made it worse. Elijah had worked at the Ellery Room for 11 years, longer than most of the chefs, longer than the maitre d', longer than half the marble tile beneath his shoes. He knew which regulars wanted their wine poured from the left and which ones wanted it poured from the right. He knew which tables tipped generously and which ones complained just to feel powerful for one evening. He had built a quiet reputation for being invisible in all the right ways, present in all the right moments, and forgettable the second his shift ended. That was the job. That was the deal he had made with the world a long time ago, and he had never once complained about the terms. What none of the executives laughing at his shoe that night could have known, what none of the servers gliding past with trays of seared scallops could have guessed, was that Elijah Carter's life was about to change in the next 90 seconds in a way that would follow him for the rest of his years. Somewhere outside, beyond the heavy oak doors of the restaurant, an old man in an ill-fitting wool coat was stepping out of a black town car parked crookedly at the curb, one hand gripping a cane, the other pressed against his chest, as though holding something in place that wanted very badly to come loose. The driver had asked him twice if he was certain about this, if he wanted to wait just one more day, one more week, until the doctors said his strength had returned even slightly. The old man had shaken his head both times. He did not have a week. He barely had days. And after 34 years of silence, of searching through private investigators and dead-end addresses and names that led nowhere, he was not about to let one more sunset pass without finishing what he had started decades ago as a much younger, much angrier, much more foolish man. His name was Solomon Grant, and very few people walking past him on the street that evening would have recognized him. He had once been the kind of name printed in bold letters across financial newspapers, the founder of an engineering and steel empire that stretched from Detroit to Atlanta to cities overseas most Americans could not point to on a map. But illness has a way of erasing a man's public shape long before it erases the man himself, and Solomon Grant now looked like nothing more than a tired grandfather in a coat 2 sizes too large, moving slowly toward a restaurant door with the kind of determination that comes only from someone who understands, with complete certainty, that this may be his very last chance. Inside, the dinner service moved on exactly as it always did. Silverware clinked. A cork was pulled with a soft, satisfying pop. At the executives' table, a woman in a sharp blazer pointed out loud at Elijah's shoe and said something about the restaurant lowering its standards, and the table laughed again, and Elijah simply refilled the next glass without lifting his eyes. He had a mother's voice in his head from a long time ago, a voice that used to say, "Let them laugh, baby. Laughter costs them nothing, and it will cost you everything if you let it in." He had carried that voice with him through every humiliating night since she passed, and it had never once failed to steady him. It was 8:47 in the evening when the front doors of the Ellery Room opened wider than they were supposed to, wide enough that the cold October air rushed briefly across the dining room and made 2 candle flames along the front tables bend sideways. The maitre d', A tall man named Preston, who prided himself on never being caught off guard, stepped forward immediately to intercept whoever had entered without a reservation, without an appointment, without so much as a phone call. But the old man in the ill-fitting coat did not stop walking. He did not even seem to see Preston standing there with his hand raised. His eyes were fixed somewhere else entirely, somewhere past the velvet ropes and the reserved signs, and the entire architecture of exclusivity the restaurant had spent years perfecting. His eyes were fixed on Elijah. The room began to notice him the way a room notices anything unfamiliar in a space built entirely on familiarity. Heads turned. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The woman in the sharp blazer stopped laughing mid-sentence, and instead watched with the particular fascination people reserve for something they cannot yet explain. Solomon Grant crossed the dining room floor one slow step at a time, his cane tapping softly against the marble, each tap seeming to grow louder as conversation around him faded into an uneasy hush. Preston tried once more to intervene, placing a hand near the old man's shoulder, but something in Solomon's expression made him withdraw the hand without a single word. Elijah finally looked up when he sensed the room had gone quiet in a way that dinner service never goes quiet, not even during a proposal, not even during an anniversary toast. He turned with the water pitcher still in his hand and found himself face to face with a stranger he did not recognize, an old man with tired eyes rimmed red from either illness or emotion or both, a man whose hand was now trembling as it rose slowly from his side and settled gently, carefully, almost reverently, onto Elijah's shoulder. For a moment neither of them spoke. The old man's eyes searched Elijah's face the way a person searches for something they have been looking for so long they have almost stopped believing it exists, tracing every feature as though comparing it against a memory he had carried, folded and worn, for over 3 decades. His hand did not move from Elijah's shoulder. His breathing was slow and shaky, the breathing of a man who had rehearsed this exact moment countless times in his head and still found himself completely unprepared for how it felt to actually live it. Then, in a voice loud enough for every single table in that dining room to hear clearly, loud enough that even the kitchen staff peering through the small round window of the swinging door went still, the old man said the words that would end Elijah Carter's ordinary life exactly as he had known it. "There you are, son. I've been looking for you for 34 years. The pitcher slipped slightly in Elijah's grip, water sloshing dangerously close to the rim before he caught it. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The executives who had been laughing at his shoe only moments earlier now stared with their forks frozen midair, their mockery replaced by something closer to confusion, and beneath that confusion, the faint, uncomfortable awareness that they had just witnessed something far larger than themselves. Somewhere near the bar, a young hostess named Renee Marshall, who had worked beside Elijah for 3 years and considered him the steadiest person she knew, took 2 involuntary steps forward, her hand pressed flat against her chest. Elijah's mind raced through every possible explanation his exhaustion could offer him. A mistake. A prank cooked up by one of the executives at that table to humiliate him further. A confused elderly man who had wandered in from the cold and mistaken him for someone else entirely, some long-lost relative from a life Elijah had never lived. But the old man's eyes did not carry the fog of confusion. They carried the sharp, unbearable clarity of a man who knew exactly who he was looking at, and exactly what those words would cost him to finally say out loud. Elijah's throat tightened as fragments of his childhood surfaced without warning, uninvited, the way old memories do when something cracks them open. His mother's voice late at night, through a thin apartment wall. "Some names cost too much to say out loud, baby. Don't go looking for what was never meant to be found." He had asked her once, only once, who his father was, and the look that crossed her face had frightened him enough that he never asked again. She had carried that silence to her grave 2 years ago, and Elijah had made peace, or told himself he had made peace, with never knowing the rest of that sentence. Now here was a stranger standing in the middle of the most exclusive dining room in the city, trembling, emotional, dressed like a man who had once commanded boardrooms and now looked like he could barely command his own legs, calling him son in front of everyone who had ever looked down on him. The dining room held its breath collectively, waiting to see what Elijah would do, waiting to see whether this was the beginning of an embarrassing scene or the beginning of something none of them yet understood. Elijah opened his mouth to ask the only question that mattered, the only question that had ever mattered his entire life. But before a single word could leave his lips, the room seemed to tilt slightly, the gold light blurring at its edges, and his own reflection in the darkened restaurant window caught his eye for just a moment, frozen, stunned, utterly changed. And that is exactly where we will pause, because what happened in the next 30 seconds inside that dining room would set into motion a chain of secrets, betrayals, and long-buried truths that had been waiting patiently for 34 years to finally come into the light. And I promise you, by the time this story reaches its end, you will understand exactly why an old man with nothing left to lose walked into a restaurant that night and risked everything just to say 2 words out loud. Stay with me, because we are only getting started, and where this story is headed, you will not want to miss a single moment of it. 3 weeks before that night at the Ellery Room, Elijah Carter's life looked nothing like the scene that would eventually freeze an entire dining room in silence. He woke most mornings at 4:30, long before the sun had any intention of rising over the city, and caught the same rattling bus that carried nurses, janitors, and second-shift workers toward jobs that rarely thanked them for showing up. He lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the east side, the same apartment his mother Loretta Carter had raised him in after fleeing a life she never once spoke about in detail. On his nightstand sat a single framed photograph of her, smiling in a way she rarely allowed herself to smile in front of others, taken the year before the illness took her from him. Elijah kept that photograph facing his bed so it would be the first thing he saw each morning and the last thing he saw each night. Loretta had raised her son with a quiet, unshakable dignity that never once bent to the circumstances around her. She worked double shifts as a nurse for over 20 years, and she taught Elijah that a man's worth was never measured by the size of his paycheck or the softness of his hands, but by how he treated people who could do absolutely nothing for him in return. Elijah carried that lesson into every table he served, every rude comment he absorbed without flinching. Every night, he tipped out the young busboy from his own modest earnings simply because the kid was trying to save for community college and nobody else seemed to notice or care. There was only one subject Loretta Carter refused to discuss, and it was the subject of Elijah's father. As a boy, Elijah had asked only once, sitting at their small kitchen table while rain tapped steadily against the window. His mother had gone still in a way that frightened him more than any answer could have, her hands folding tightly in her lap, her eyes drifting somewhere far beyond that kitchen. She told him simply that some names cost too much to say out loud, and that he should never go looking for what was never meant to be found. Elijah, only 8 years old at the time, had never asked again, though the question never fully left him either. It simply learned to stay quiet, the way most things in that apartment eventually learned to stay quiet. At the Ellery Room, Elijah's closest friend was a hostess named Renee Marshall, a sharp, warm-eyed woman in her early 30s who had worked alongside him for nearly 3 years. Renee possessed the rare talent of making even the coldest regulars feel welcomed at the door, yet she reserved her true warmth for the people the restaurant tended to overlook, especially Elijah. She noticed things about him that most people never bothered to notice. The way his shoulders tensed slightly whenever certain tables mocked the staff. The way he always waited until his shift ended before allowing his exhaustion to show on his face. More than once she had covered a shift for him without being asked, and more than once she had walked him quietly to the bus stop after a particularly brutal night, saying nothing, simply making certain he did not have to stand there alone. The restaurant's most difficult table belonged to a woman named Vanessa Grant Whitmore and her rotating circle of business associates, all of whom seemed to treat the staff as background scenery rather than human beings. Vanessa was polished in the way that money teaches a person to be polished, her voice smooth and controlled even when she was being cruel, her cruelty delivered with a practiced smile that made it easy for her to deny it had ever happened at all. She had a habit of speaking about the waitstaff as though they could not hear her, complaining loudly about service that was, in truth, flawless, simply because it amused her to remind everyone in the room exactly where the power sat. Elijah had long ago stopped expecting decency from her table, and he had trained himself to absorb her comments the way rainwater is absorbed by dry, cracked earth, quietly, without complaint, leaving no visible trace behind. On a particular Thursday evening 3 weeks before Solomon Grant walked through those front doors, Vanessa's table ordered a bottle of wine that the sommelier, distracted by a larger party across the room, poured incorrectly. It was a simple mistake, the kind that happens in every restaurant on any given night, and under normal circumstances it would have been corrected quietly with an apology and a replacement bottle. But Vanessa saw an opportunity to make an example of someone, and rather than blame the sommelier standing directly beside her, she turned instead toward Elijah, who had done nothing more than refill her water glass moments earlier, and loudly declared that he had brought her the wrong bottle entirely. The restaurant's manager, a nervous, image-obsessed man named Bradley Simmons who valued Vanessa's recurring reservations far more than he valued fairness, rushed to the table without asking a single question. He apologized profusely to Vanessa, promised the meal would be comped in full, and then turned to Elijah in front of the entire dining room and told him, in a voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear clearly, that his services were no longer needed. 11 years of loyalty, 11 years of showing up before sunrise and leaving long after sunset, dismissed in less than 30 seconds over a mistake he had never made, simply because it was easier to sacrifice him than to inconvenience a paying customer. Renee stepped forward immediately, her voice sharp with disbelief as she explained to Bradley that she had personally seen the sommelier pour that exact bottle, that Elijah had nothing to do with the error at all. Bradley's jaw tightened, and rather than reconsider his decision, he warned Renee coldly that if she continued raising her voice about the matter, her own position might need to be reconsidered as well. Renee fell silent, not out of agreement, but because she understood, painfully, that neither of their jobs mattered enough to the people running that restaurant for the truth to matter more than convenience. Elijah untied his apron slowly, folded it with the same careful precision he brought to every task he had ever performed in that building, and placed it gently on the service station without a single word of protest. He had learned long ago that arguing rarely changed outcomes for people like him, that dignity sometimes meant walking away quietly rather than begging to be believed. As he stepped through the front doors into a cold October rain, the same executives who had mocked his frayed shoelace earlier that same week watched him leave through the restaurant's tall front windows, some smirking faintly, most simply returning their attention back to their plates, as though nothing significant had occurred at all. What none of them noticed, and what Elijah himself did not notice either, was the black town car idling quietly at the far end of the curb, its rear window cracked just enough to let in the cold night air. Inside that car sat an old man wrapped in a wool coat 2 sizes too large for his weakened frame, watching Elijah walk away into the rain with an expression that mixed decades of guilt with something close to desperate, aching hope. Solomon Grant had been searching for this exact young man for over 3 decades, and after everything his private investigators had uncovered in recent months, after everything his own doctors had recently told him about the time he had left, he was not about to let one rainy October night pass without finally working up the courage to approach him directly. But courage, as Solomon would soon learn, could not simply be summoned on command after 34 years of silence. and he instructed his driver to continue on that night without approaching Elijah at all, telling himself he needed one more day to prepare exactly the right words, though in truth he understood, somewhere deep beneath his exhaustion, that no amount of preparation could ever make an apology of this size feel adequate. In the days that followed his abrupt dismissal, Elijah's situation deteriorated with the kind of quiet cruelty that poverty often delivers, not through one dramatic blow, but through a steady accumulation of smaller ones. His landlord, a stern man named Harold Whitaker, who had never once been generous with deadlines, informed him that rent would be increasing at the end of the month regardless of his employment status, and that any missed payment would result in eviction proceedings beginning immediately. Elijah spent his mornings submitting applications to restaurants across the city, only to be told repeatedly that positions were filled, or that his experience, ironically, made him overqualified for the entry-level roles still available. By the end of that first week, he had accepted a temporary position unloading trucks at a warehouse on the far side of the city, working overnight shifts for far less than he had earned as a waiter, his hands blistering in ways they had not blistered since he was a teenager, helping his mother move furniture between apartments. During one of those long, exhausting nights, while sorting through a small box of his mother's belongings that he had never fully unpacked since her passing 2 years earlier, Elijah discovered a folded, water-stained envelope tucked inside the lining of an old sewing kit. The envelope contained a single half-finished letter written in his mother's familiar handwriting. The ink faded with age, the final sentence cut off mid-thought, as though she had been interrupted, or perhaps had simply lost the courage to finish it. The letter mentioned no names directly, but it spoke of a family with more money than conscience, a promise that had been broken, and a decision she had made to protect her son from a truth she believed would cause him far more harm than comfort. Elijah read it 3 times that night, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, before carefully folding it back into its envelope and placing it beneath his mother's photograph, unable yet to fully process what it meant. Renee visited him that same week, arriving unannounced with a bag of groceries she insisted were simply left over from her own shopping, though Elijah suspected otherwise. She sat across from him at his small kitchen table, the same table where he had once asked his mother about his father all those years ago, and told him plainly that she believed in him, that the people who had humiliated him at that restaurant would eventually answer for how they treated others, even if she did not yet know how or when that reckoning might arrive. Her words offered him little practical comfort given his mounting bills, but they offered him something perhaps more important, the quiet reassurance that at least one person in his life still saw him clearly, still recognized his worth even when the rest of the world seemed determined to overlook it entirely. It was during that same difficult week that Solomon Grant made his first direct attempt at contact, arriving at the warehouse where Elijah now worked, leaning heavily on his cane as he approached the loading dock during a break in Elijah's shift. Elijah, exhausted and wary of strangers approaching him in dimly lit parking lots, assumed immediately that the old man was either lost or attempting some kind of confident scheme, and he told him firmly, though not unkindly, that he wanted no trouble and had nowhere further to talk. Solomon, his prepared words once again failing him at the critical moment, simply nodded, apologized for the intrusion, and returned to his car, watching in his side mirror as Elijah disappeared back into the warehouse, no wiser to who had just approached him or why. 2 more days passed before Solomon Grant, now visibly weaker, informed his longtime attorney Terrence Dupree that he intended to try again. This time somewhere Elijah could not simply walk away without an audience present. Somewhere the truth would be forced into the light whether Elijah wanted it or not. Terrence, who had helped manage Solomon's affairs for over 20 years, and who carried his own uneasy knowledge of exactly why this search had taken 34 years to reach its conclusion, cautioned him gently against such a public approach, warning that it might do more harm than good. But Solomon, aware now more than ever that his remaining time could be measured in weeks rather than years, told Terence plainly that he had spent 3 decades being careful, and that carefulness had cost him more than he was willing to keep paying. And so, on a rainy October evening not long after, Solomon Grant instructed his driver to take him to the Ellery Room, the restaurant where his investigators had confirmed Elijah still occasionally picked up shifts covering for former co-workers during the busy dinner rush. And it was there, in front of an entire dining room full of strangers who had spent years looking down on a man they never bothered to understand, that Solomon Grant finally said the words he had rehearsed and abandoned 1,000 times before, the words that would finally break 34 years of silence wide open. "There you are, son. I've been looking for you for 34 years. Now, standing frozen in that dining room with the pitcher trembling slightly in his grip, Elijah searched the old man's face for any sign of confusion, any sign that this might simply be a case of mistaken identity, but he found only clarity there, only the unbearable certainty of a man who knew precisely who he was looking at. Renee moved closer instinctively, her hand still pressed against her chest, while Bradley Simmons stood paralyzed near the host's stand, uncertain whether to intervene or simply watch whatever was unfolding play out to its conclusion. Vanessa Grant Whitmore, seated at her usual table, went suddenly, unnaturally pale, her wine glass halted halfway to her lips, though at that moment nobody else in the room understood why. Solomon's hand remained steady on Elijah's shoulder, and in a voice noticeably softer now, meant only for Elijah though the silence of the room carried it to every table regardless, he explained that he was not asking for forgiveness that night, and he was not asking Elijah to understand everything all at once. He was asking only for a few minutes of his time, away from the eyes of strangers, so that he could finally explain a truth he should have explained 34 years earlier, a truth that involved his mother, a promise broken long before Elijah was born, and a family secret that had cost far more people than either of them realized. Elijah's mind returned once more to his mother's unfinished letter, to the words she had never gotten the chance to complete, and for the first time in his adult life, he found himself unable to simply walk away from a difficult moment the way he had trained himself to do for so many years. Something in this old man's eyes, something in the exhausted, desperate honesty of his expression, told Elijah that whatever waited on the other side of this conversation would change the shape of his entire life, whether he was ready for that change or not. He set the pitcher down slowly on the nearest table, ignoring the stares of the executives who had mocked him only days earlier, and for the first time that evening, he spoke. "Who are you?" he asked quietly, "and why does my mother's voice suddenly feel so loud in my head right now?" The old man's eyes filled instantly, and he asked simply if there was somewhere quieter they might speak, somewhere away from the watching room. And Elijah, after a long pause that felt to him like it lasted several lifetimes, nodded once and led him toward the small private room near the back of the restaurant usually reserved for wedding parties and anniversary dinners, a room that was about to witness a very different kind of gathering entirely. What Solomon Grant revealed to Elijah in that quiet back room, over the course of the next several hours, would unravel a secret that stretched back more than 3 decades, involving his own late brother, a woman named Loretta who had once worked as a private nurse for the Grant family, a pregnancy that threatened the reputation of an entire business empire, and a settlement that had been quietly buried by people determined to protect everything except the truth. But that story, the story of what truly happened all those years ago, and the story of what Elijah would ultimately choose to do with the truth once it finally reached him, is one we will continue unfolding in the next part of this journey together. If this story has already pulled at something in you, stay close, because everything Elijah is about to learn will change not only how he sees his own past, but how he sees the very idea of family itself. And I promise you, the deepest twist in this story has not yet arrived. The old man lowered himself slowly into one of the velvet chairs inside that quiet back room, and Elijah remained standing near the door for a long moment, unsure whether he wanted to sit across from a stranger who had just upended his entire evening in front of dozens of witnesses. Solomon Grant did not rush him. He simply waited, hands folded over the head of his cane, his breathing slow and labored, until Elijah finally crossed the room and took the seat across from him, arms folded tightly over his chest as though bracing for impact. Solomon began by saying he understood Elijah owed him nothing, not his time, not his patience, and certainly not his forgiveness, but he asked for the chance to explain regardless, because he had waited 34 years to say what he was about to say, and he did not intend to die with it still unspoken. Elijah's jaw tightened at the mention of dying, and Solomon, noticing the reaction, confirmed quietly that he was indeed sick, that the doctors had given him only a handful of months, and that this single fact was the reason he had finally found the courage to walk into that restaurant after decades of silence. He explained that 35 years earlier, his younger brother, a man named Augustus Grant, had fallen in love with a young private nurse hired to care for their aging mother during her final illness. That nurse was Loretta Carter. Augustus had been charming in the way wealthy men often learn to be charming, generous with his attention in ways that felt sincere at the time, and Loretta, only 23 years old and far from her own family, had fallen for him completely. Solomon's voice grew heavier as he continued, explaining that when Loretta discovered she was pregnant, Augustus panicked, terrified of how their mother and the family's business partners would react to a scandal involving a nurse rather than someone from their own social circle. Rather than stand beside her, Augustus went to their family's attorney, a young man just beginning his career named Marcus Hale, and together they arranged a quiet settlement, a modest sum of money offered to Loretta in exchange for her silence and her disappearance from the family's life entirely. Solomon admitted, his voice cracking slightly, that he had known about the arrangement at the time and had said nothing, believing then that protecting the family name mattered more than protecting a young woman who had trusted his brother with her heart. Elijah's hands curled into fists on his lap as he listened, though he said nothing yet, letting the old man continue. Loretta had refused the settlement entirely, Solomon explained, something none of them had expected. She wanted no money in exchange for erasing her child's existence, and instead she simply vanished on her own terms, moving to another city, changing nothing about her name but everything about her circumstances, choosing to raise her son alone rather than accept a payoff that felt to her like an admission that her child was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. Solomon said he had not learned the full truth of what she chose until many years later, long after Augustus himself had died in a car accident, carrying his guilt with him to an early grave at just 41 years old. For over a decade after his brother's death, Solomon admitted he had told himself the matter was settled, that Loretta had made her choice, and it was not his place to interfere with a life she had deliberately built away from them. But as he grew older, and especially after his own diagnosis arrived 6 weeks earlier, he found himself unable to shake the guilt of having stayed silent while his brother destroyed a young woman's trust and abandoned a child who had done nothing to deserve it. He hired investigators, tracked down old medical records, and eventually confirmed what he had long suspected, that Loretta's son, now a grown man working quietly as a waiter in one of the city's finest restaurants, was his own nephew, the closest living blood relative he had left in this world. Elijah finally spoke, his voice low and unsteady, asking why Solomon had called him son back in that dining room if Augustus, not Solomon himself, was his biological father. Solomon's eyes filled again, and he explained softly that he had used the word deliberately, not out of confusion, but because blood alone had never been the point of his search. He said that Augustus had failed Elijah in every way a father could fail a child, and that somebody in this family owed him not just an apology, but an acknowledgement, a place, a name spoken with pride instead of shame. He said he did not expect Elijah to call him father in return, only to allow him the chance to finally do right by a debt his own family had ignored for over 3 decades. Marcus Hale, the same attorney who had drafted the original settlement decades earlier, arrived at the restaurant nearly an hour later at Solomon's request, carrying a leather folder containing documents that had remained sealed in a private vault for over 30 years. Marcus, now in his 60s, entered the room with visible unease, his eyes darting toward Elijah before settling on Solomon with an expression that mixed relief and dread in equal measure, as though he had spent decades waiting for this exact meeting and equally dreading its arrival. Elijah watched the exchange between the two older men carefully, sensing immediately that Marcus knew far more than he had said so far. Solomon instructed Marcus plainly to tell Elijah everything. No omissions, no careful legal language designed to protect the family's reputation any longer. Marcus hesitated only briefly before opening the folder and explaining that the original settlement offer to Loretta had included not just a payout, but a formal document requiring her to legally waive any future claim to the Grant family name or fortune on behalf of her unborn child, a document she had refused to sign despite considerable pressure applied by the family's representatives at the time. Elijah's throat tightened as he listened, understanding now more fully than ever the quiet strength his mother had carried her entire life without ever once explaining its origin to him. Marcus continued, his voice growing quieter, revealing that Augustus had, in fact, left behind a private letter of his own before his death, one he had written to Loretta but never sent, a letter Marcus had kept locked away out of guilt for over 20 years rather than either destroying it or delivering it. He produced the letter now, handing it carefully to Elijah, who unfolded the yellowed paper with trembling hands and read his biological father's own handwriting for the very first time in his life, an apology written by a man too cowardly to have delivered it while he was still alive to say it himself. The letter admitted, in Augustus's own words, that walking away from Loretta and their child remained the single greatest regret of his short life, that he had convinced himself at the time that money could substitute for presence, and that he had come to understand, far too late, that some absences can never truly be repaid. Elijah read the letter twice, his eyes burning, before setting it down carefully on the table between them, his anger now tangled together with a grief he had not expected to feel for a man he had never known existed until that very night. It was at this point that Marcus revealed the detail that would change the entire direction of everything that followed. He explained, carefully, that upon Augustus's death, his share of the family's holdings had legally passed first to Solomon as the surviving brother, and that a private trust had quietly been established decades earlier, funded modestly at first, but grown substantially over the years through careful investment, intended specifically for Augustus's unacknowledged child should he ever be found. The existence of that trust, Marcus admitted, had been deliberately concealed from one particular family member for reasons that would soon become painfully clear. Elijah asked plainly who had been kept in the dark, and Solomon's expression darkened for the first time that evening, the guilt in his face replaced briefly by something closer to controlled anger. He explained that his daughter, a woman named Vanessa Grant Whitmore, had known for years that an illegitimate heir existed somewhere in the world, and rather than support her father's efforts to locate him, she had spent considerable resources of her own attempting to ensure that Elijah was never found at all, terrified that his existence might threaten the inheritance she considered rightfully hers alone. Elijah's breath caught sharply in his chest as the name registered fully, the memory of the cold, polished woman who had gotten him fired only weeks earlier flooding back with a clarity that made his stomach turn. Vanessa Grant Whitmore, the very woman who had blamed him for a wine mix-up that was never his fault, who had cost him his job of 11 years without a flicker of hesitation, was in fact his own first cousin, a woman who had looked directly into his face on countless nights and treated him as disposable, while secretly working to ensure he never learned the truth that connected them. Solomon confirmed, his voice heavy with shame, that he suspected Vanessa's targeting of Elijah at the restaurant had not been entirely coincidental, that her private investigators had likely identified Elijah months earlier, and that her cruelty toward him may have been a calculated attempt to destabilize his life and drive him far from the city before Solomon's own search could reach its conclusion. Elijah sat in stunned silence, replaying every humiliating night at that restaurant through this new, devastating lens, understanding now that his suffering had not simply been the random cruelty of a spoiled woman, but a deliberate strategy designed to protect a fortune she feared losing. Renee, who had quietly waited outside the private room for over an hour, growing increasingly worried, finally knocked gently and stepped inside when Elijah did not object, sensing immediately from his expression that whatever he had just learned had shaken him to his core. Elijah looked at her, his eyes glassy, and said simply that everything he thought he understood about his life until that very night had just been rewritten in the space of a single conversation. Renee sat beside him without a word, taking his hand firmly in hers, offering the same silent steadiness she had offered him through every difficult night at that restaurant. Solomon, visibly exhausted now, his energy clearly fading, told Elijah that he did not expect him to make any decisions that night, that the trust existed regardless of whatever relationship Elijah chose or did not choose to build with him going forward, and that his only remaining wish before his time ran out was to see Elijah's rightful place within the family formally and publicly acknowledged, both to honor Augustus's unspoken apology and to correct 34 years of silent Solomon himself had allowed to continue for far too long. Elijah left the restaurant that night carrying Augustus's letter folded carefully inside his jacket pocket, his mind a storm of anger, grief, disbelief, and something unfamiliar that felt almost like hope, though he was not yet ready to name it as such. Over the following days, Marcus arranged a private meeting between Elijah and the family's small executive board, explaining that Solomon intended to formally introduce Elijah as Augustus's son and rightful trust beneficiary before the full leadership of Callaway Grant Holdings, a move that would inevitably provoke Vanessa's fury the moment she learned of it. Vanessa did learn of it almost immediately, her private assistant alerting her within hours of the meeting being scheduled, and she wasted no time confronting her father directly at his estate, her earlier polish replaced entirely by barely controlled panic as she accused him of endangering everything their family had built over generations for the sake of a stranger who meant nothing to their legacy. Solomon, weakened but resolute, told his daughter plainly that Elijah was not a stranger, that he was Augustus's son and her own first cousin, and that continuing to deny that truth would not protect the family's legacy, but would instead ensure its final, complete corruption. Vanessa left her father's estate that evening determined to prevent the board meeting from ever taking place, contacting Marcus Hale privately and offering him a substantial sum of money to destroy the settlement documents, the trust paperwork, and Augustus's letter entirely, insisting that without physical proof, Elijah's claim would amount to nothing more than an old, dying man's confused ramblings. Marcus, who had carried the weight of his silence for over 3 decades already, finally refused her outright, telling her plainly that he had already spent too many years protecting a lie, and that he did not intend to spend whatever years remained doing the same. Furious and increasingly desperate, Vanessa turned instead to Bradley Simmons, the restaurant manager who had fired Elijah weeks earlier, offering him a considerable bribe to publicly claim that Elijah had a history of dishonesty and theft during his years of employment, hoping to discredit him before the board ever had the chance to hear his story directly. Bradley, terrified of losing his own position should the truth of the Grant family's connection to the restaurant eventually surface, agreed initially, though his conscience began weighing on him heavily in the days leading up to the scheduled meeting. The board meeting took place on a gray Tuesday morning inside the glass-walled executive offices of Callaway Grant Holdings, with Solomon seated at the head of the table, visibly weakened but dressed formally for what he considered one of the most important moments remaining in his life. Elijah sat beside Renee, who had insisted on accompanying him for support, both of them dressed simply amid a room full of tailored suits and skeptical, unfamiliar faces. Vanessa arrived last, composed once again, her earlier panic buried beneath a practiced, confident smile as she took her seat directly across from Elijah. Marcus opened the meeting by presenting the settlement documents, the trust paperwork, and finally Augustus's handwritten letter, reading portions of it aloud to the board despite Vanessa's visible discomfort, establishing clearly and undeniably Elijah's identity and his rightful claim as Augustus's biological son. Vanessa attempted to interject, suggesting the documents could easily have been forged or manipulated, but Solomon, gathering the last of his strength, spoke over her firmly, confirming personally and publicly that every document presented was authentic, and that he alone had ordered their preservation decades earlier specifically for this exact moment. Bradley Simmons, who had been asked to attend the meeting to offer testimony against Elijah's character, stood nervously when called upon, his prepared lie sitting uncomfortably in his throat as he looked briefly toward Elijah, remembering suddenly and vividly 11 years of quiet dedication he had personally witnessed and then betrayed without hesitation weeks earlier. Rather than deliver the false testimony Vanessa had paid him to give, Bradley instead admitted plainly that Elijah had been the most reliable, honest employee he had ever managed, and that his termination weeks earlier had been unjust, driven by pressure from a valued client rather than any genuine misconduct on Elijah's part. Vanessa's composure finally shattered as the room turned its attention toward her, and in a final, desperate attempt to salvage her position, she accused her father openly of losing his judgment to illness, suggesting the entire board should question his mental competency rather than honor his wishes regarding Elijah's inheritance. Solomon, his voice steady despite his physical frailty, told his daughter calmly that his mind had never been clearer, that dying had simply given him the clarity to finally correct a mistake he had allowed to continue for 34 years, and that no amount of her anger would change what he intended to do next. The board, moved by the weight of evidence and Bradley's unexpected honesty, voted unanimously to formally recognize Elijah as a legitimate beneficiary of the family trust, with Solomon personally overseeing the transition of a modest, dignified portion of the family's holdings into Elijah's name, an amount significant enough to secure his future comfortably but deliberately restrained, reflecting Solomon's understanding that Elijah had never sought wealth, only the truth and the recognition. His mother had been denied for over 3 decades. In the weeks that followed, Solomon's health declined rapidly, and Elijah found himself visiting the old man's estate several times each week, their conversations growing gentler and more personal with each visit, filled increasingly with questions about Loretta, about the childhood Solomon had missed entirely, about small details that mattered only because they had been withheld for so long. Renee often accompanied him, and slowly, the estate that had once felt cold and unfamiliar began to feel, however briefly, like something resembling family. Solomon Grant passed away peacefully on a quiet November morning, with Elijah seated beside his bed holding his hand, the same hand that had trembled against his shoulder in that crowded dining room weeks earlier, now finally still. His final words to Elijah were simple, an apology once more for the silence of 34 years, followed by a request that Elijah never allow guilt or grievance to define the rest of his life the way it had defined so much of Solomon's own. Elijah promised him quietly that he would not, and for the first time since his mother's passing 2 years earlier, he allowed himself to grieve openly, without needing to hide his tears from anyone watching. The will was read privately within days, granting Elijah his rightful inheritance while notably reducing Vanessa's share significantly. A final decision Solomon had made not out of cruelty toward his daughter, but as a quiet correction toward decades of imbalance within a family that had rewarded ruthlessness while punishing honesty. Vanessa contested nothing publicly, understanding that any further attempt to fight the decision would only further expose the lengths she had gone to protect her own inheritance at Elijah's expense. Months later, Elijah returned to the Ellery room, not as an employee, but as a guest, choosing to dine there quietly with Renee on an ordinary Thursday evening. As they were seated, he noticed a young waiter, no older than 19, being quietly humiliated by a table of wealthy diners over a mistake that clearly was not his own. The same kind of scene Elijah had endured countless times over 11 long years. Without hesitation, Elijah rose from his table, walked calmly toward the young man, and settled the entire table's bill himself, telling the stunned young waiter quietly that somebody had once needed exactly this kind of kindness and never received it, and that he did not intend to let that happen again while it was within his power to prevent it. Word of Elijah's quiet generosity spread slowly through the restaurant industry in the months that followed, though Elijah himself never sought recognition for it, preferring instead to let his actions speak in the same understated way his mother had once lived her entire life. He eventually used a portion of his inheritance to establish a small scholarship fund in Loretta Carter's name, dedicated to supporting the children of single mothers working in hospitality and healthcare, ensuring that her quiet strength would continue shaping lives long after her passing, in ways she never could have imagined during her own difficult years. And so the story of Elijah Carter closes not with bitterness toward the family that had failed him for 34 years, but with a quiet, hard-won peace, a peace built not on the money he ultimately received, but on the truth he had finally been allowed to know, and the dignity his mother had protected fiercely, even when the world around her gave her every reason to abandon it. Some names, it turns out, do cost too much to say out loud, until the moment finally arrives when silence costs far more than the truth ever could, and in that moment, everything changes. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story like this one.